In 1903, the Wright brothers made the first powered flights in the history of the world. A mere 70 years later came Concorde. But the Wright brothers weren't the first men to take to the air. If the designs and experiments of this 18th century Yorkshire landowner had been taken seriously, the Wright brothers might have flown years earlier. So might Concorde.
Today, it is universally acknowledged that Sir George Cayley was the true father of the modern aeroplane. That is to say, he not only laid the foundations of modern aerodynamics, but he understood flight control in almost all its aspects. He built model aeroplanes, and then full-size aeroplanes, and finally man-carrying aeroplanes. Not powered, of course, gliders.
Sir George Cayley was making this type of model as early as 1818. It's a simple paper kite, probably a relic from his boyhood. It has another little kite at the back, slightly elevated, with a little rudder surface on it, and the whole thing at the back is mounted on a piece of wire so that you can adjust it. It's balanced at the front by a piece of lead. The point of balance is quite well forward, as you can see, about here, and it has the also the feature of dihedral angle for lateral stability.
For years, John Sproule, an ex-Fleet Air Arm helicopter expert and Associate Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, had been fascinated by the Cayley question. Was Sir George a man with ideas far in advance of his time, or merely an interesting but impractical dreamer? Sproule decided to repeat some of Sir George's experiments.
This is Sir George Cayley's 1852 riding rudder model, so called because the rudder rides on the tailplane, which you'll see is in a very modern position. It's where all the tails are on aeroplanes nowadays. The wing, again in accordance with Sir George Cayley's simple solutions, is very short, and it's high up from the fuselage to give pendulum stability. It was a demonstrator to demonstrate his theories of dynamic flight. It's a most modern flying machine and flies remarkably well. These Cayley models fly so well, but the question naturally arises, how would one of Cayley's large man carriers perform?
There was only one sure way to find out, and here came a lucky break. For a plan of Cayley's governable parachute was discovered in a copy of the Mechanics magazine, dated 1852. It was a cumbersome machine with a large sail wing over a boat-like car. But though considerable detail was shown, to translate this design into working drawings for the builder was a difficult task.
Well, here it is, Ken. This is my preliminary sketch of the machine which we decided to build at our meeting at the Aeronautical Society. Yeah. As you'll see, it's pretty big, nearly 40 feet long.
The governable parachute may have been designed for launching from a balloon, but it was still essentially a glider. So Sproule approached Ken Fripp, a Hampshire glider builder, with a plan to build Cayley's monster.
The golden rule, I think we have to observe, is that we must only use materials which Sir George could have used at the time. This is the control system, up and down for elevator in pitch, left and right for rudder control. I think we might call that the influencer. It influences what happens with this one.
Yes. What about this main beam? How is this constructed?
It's a hollow tapered beam. It's 4 inches square at the center. The walls are 0.8 thick, tapering to each end. It's quite long. It's about 28 feet long.
Gliders are creatures of the air and are built by skilled craftsmen. 2 of Ken Fripp's men, Alan Bagent and Fred Stickland, undertook the task of building the replica of Sir George's machine. Gradually, in their hands, the governable parachute began to take extraordinary shape. It looked more like a boat than a plane. To supplement the design details, the builders were able to turn to the Royal Aeronautical Society, where Sir George's original notebooks are kept in the archives of flying. Aviation historian Charles Gibbs Smith explains.
Sir George Cayley was really one of the most remarkable Englishmen, not only of his own time, but of all time. He was, in a manner of speaking, a mini Leonardo da Vinci. Now, a lot of the basis of the whole history of aeronautics can be found in these incredible notebooks that have turned up over the years of Cayley's. We are incredibly lucky to have 5 complete notebooks, and they go from aeroplane undercarriages to a recipe for making honey, a report on a sick cow, back to an aeroplane wing. It was the day book of a busy, inquiring mind running a large estate.
George Cayley was born in Scarborough, Yorkshire, on December the 27th, 1773. His mother appointed 2 distinguished scientists, George Walker and George Morgan, as his tutors, and also encouraged her son's practical interests. But Cayley was never far from the sea and the ships, which influenced so much of his later aeronautical designs. At the age of 18, George Cayley inherited the title and became master of Brompton Hall. At last, he was able to give full rein to his scientific and engineering genius. In this small workshop in his garden, Cayley, assisted by his mechanic Vic, was for the next 65 years to design and build gliders, helicopters, airships, engines. Here, in fact, is the true birthplace, not only of the British aircraft industry, but of the aeroplane itself. But Cayley was interested in more than flying. He was interested in everything. His experiments in streamlining, for example, based on trout and dolphin shapes, led him at the time of the Napoleonic Wars to design finned projectiles to be fired from ships' cannons. And when the son of one of his tenants lost a hand, Cayley became interested in improving the design of artificial limbs. In 1808, when the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, burned down, Cayley submitted a revolutionary new design for the auditorium. He also found time to enter Parliament, to co-found the Regent Street Polytechnic. But above all, he always returned to his flying.
Now, his first little flying instrument, shall we say, was a little helicopter model which he copied from the French in 1796. This was not much more than a boyish interest showing up. But then, already in 1799, he had conceived the basis of the modern aeroplane, which is not, as we used to call it, an ornithopter, i.e. a flapping wing thing like a bird, but he realized that for a modern aeroplane, the bird's wings had to be held rigid, and the bird had to be propelled through the air by a source other than the flapping of the wings. And this brilliant departure he had crystallized fully by 1799, that's to say before last century, just soon after the French Revolution, which is quite incredible. Here is the model, Cayley's drawing of the model, which is the first glider model proper in history, 1804. He's scratched out, you see, the first one, then he's drawn it in properly. A little kite fixed on a pole with a little tail unit. Then, in 1809, he built his first full-size glider. Think of it. And a man was put in this, and although he didn't fly in a proper sense, it did lift itself off the ground, and this man was, in fact, airborne. Late in his life, this remarkable man took to designing, believe it or not, a convertiplane. That's to say, a machine that is a mixture between a helicopter and an aeroplane, rather like our Harrier today. This machine, composed of 4 inclined circular planes with 2 propellers at the back. The circular planes opened out when on the ground to form 4 propellers, which propelled the device upwards, and then the idea was that the propellers proper would take over and propel the machine horizontally through the air, while the 4 surfaces would then close into 4 wings and should be off the first biplane of all time.
The wing of the Cayley machine is a large sail which had to be cut accurately, with strong corner points to take the load through into the structure. No doubt in Cayley's day he was able to call upon a great deal of skill in the fishing port of Scarborough. But now the problem was to find a sailmaker who could work in traditional cotton. For these days, it has been largely replaced with man-made fibers. The set of the sail was all important, so that the wind would curve it into an efficient lifting surface. 4 months into the project and the first assembly, Cayley's large bird was nearing completion. But despite its size, the assembly was, in the Cayley manner, a matter of simple logic. The rigging, however, proved tedious, for the many specially designed wires and bracing ties had to be fitted one by one, and then carefully adjusted to carry their specific load. Such was Cayley's early understanding of aircraft design that to increase stability, he incorporated 8 degrees of dihedral angle into each side of the frame that supported the sail wing. The cruciform tail, with 50 square feet in each plane surface, had to be made in such a way that the cotton material could be braced tightly and adjusted if necessary.
Harry, I was just saying, while we're doing this, right?
This unusual tail unit was carried on the rear of the main beam on a type of universal joint, which enabled adjustment both up and down and left and right for the trimming of the aircraft.
Long as a piece of string.
Long as a piece of string.
A very important thing in the building of the man carrier was establishing the center of gravity, the point of balance. So we built this large model to fly and to experiment with, to give us this very valuable information. And we found that it balances quite well forward, as you can see. Please.
All that remained now was to weigh the glider and to establish its center of gravity with the pilot aboard. By this time, Sproul and Fripp had found a man who was prepared to pilot Sir George's extraordinary machine on its maiden flight. He was Derek Piggott, a well-known gliding instructor and film pilot.
Slack it off, Fred. Look here away. Take the strain, please. It's getting towards it. See, the model CG was the equivalent of about 3 feet from the point, so we're not far off it, and with less incidence on the tailplane.
Sir George gave in his notes that the machine empty should weigh about 150 pounds, and with the pilot aboard, a total of 300 pounds. To strengthen it, and thus add a margin of safety, it was necessary for John Sproul to exceed this figure. The aircraft would have to stand up to repeated use for filming, and not collapse about the ears of its pilot. 120 years ago, Sir George Cayley's coachman had flown in Brompton Dale in a machine very similar to this. "Don't let me hear of any rash trial with this dangerous machine," Sir George had written. Derek Piggott was about to discover just how dangerous it could be.
Well, after flying modern gliders and airplanes, this looks a very interesting thing to fly, and I'm looking forward to it. Of course, we know from the model experiments that it should be fairly stable, and the real question is how much control we'll have over the thing with this influencer, this tiller. So what we have to do is to start off gently with some low hops and find as we go along how the thing controls, because of course the only other person who knows about this airplane is the coachman, and anything he's found out has long since been forgotten. The very first taxiing runs were really just trials of the undercarriage, just to see the wheels were strong enough. and to see if the airplane showed any sign of lifting at all. On this one, we're going along at about 5 or 6 miles an hour, and it didn't show very much signs of leaving, but at least we found the wheels were good, the shock absorption reasonable. And towards the end of the run, I just released the tow rope because I realized we got to go much faster than this for takeoff. Well, the wind's a little stronger on this day, and on this run we must have reached almost 25 miles an hour of airspeed. And although the sail is filled right out, it still didn't seem to be lifting. And altogether, it's a little bit puzzling as to why it didn't come off. Well, we've got the wing at the instance which Sir George Cayley suggested in his notes. So it looks rather as though we've either got to tow much faster or else have the wing at a big instance. As a quick way of doing this, we've taken the rear wheel off, and straightway you can see the sail filling much quicker, and the airplane's obviously ready to fly now. And we're off the ground for the first time. A very exciting moment as the airplane comes off, and it just tips slightly, and the stability brings it back level. Here again, on the next run, a little bit more speed should get us off the ground properly this time. And sure enough, exciting moment as we come right off the ground for the first time ever. Back down again for a few seconds, and then a little more speed, and we're airborne. A nice gentle landing, and all safe and sound.
The machine had flown at last. Sproul and Fripp could now face the future with some confidence.
On the next flight, the airplane leapt off the ground, and within a few seconds we were very high up, much higher than we'd ever meant to be.
Slow it down, Ken. Slow it down. Slow down gently.
And I couldn't get the nose down, and when the car slowed down, it came down very heavily.
Okay. Very little damage.
We broke the axle. That was about all. And from then on, it was a case of just working up for more flights, some of which were successful. This one, the airplane didn't leave the ground. The left-hand wheel was seized up slightly, and it swung the airplane to the left, and the wind got under the wingtip, and we rolled right over up onto the tip, and we hung there for a few seconds. And then there was a loud report as the spar broke at the wingtip.
Ooh. Okay. That's all right.
To begin with, I thought, well, that's a write-off. Rather frightening experience. I thought it was going right over. But actually, the damage wasn't so serious. And it was just the spar in one wingtip which had broken. Well, it was merely an overnight job. And then the next day, we were in business to try and see if the controlling really worked and get some longer flights. And here we are off the ground. And there's a cameraman ahead, and so I tried to swing the airplane off to the left with the boom, and it did in fact turn. And that was the first time we actually got a real response from the control. And that was really the first really successful flight. It's very exciting on this thing, and the beginning of the takeoff run, you get the roar of the wheels, and then quite suddenly the airplane lifting off and it all going quiet, and very buoyant feeling as it lifts up. And then I can just move this boom up and use the influencer to lower the nose and get the airplane leveled out again. And also, once or twice I've been able to use the boom sideways and turn it a little bit one way and the other, so really the control is working. The only thing is, as it comes in for the landing, even though I move the boom right down to get the nose up for the landing like an ordinary airplane or glider, usually the landing is a little bit heavy. But when you consider it was made and designed, or designed back in 1853, you can't help feeling what a wonderful airplane it is to do this. Once we knew it was controllable, it was just a matter of getting used to the controls and getting confidence in using them. And this next hop was probably one of the better ones we did.
Keep going. Keep going. That's fine.
By the time we'd finished this flight, with the amount of flying we got, we really were beginning to feel we were confident enough to go and try a flight in the Dale.
Brompton Dale lies just across the Scarborough Road from Brompton Hall. Here, Sir George flew his models and his man-carrying gliders. Here, the coachman flew, and a nameless small boy. Here, in two extraordinary decades of creativity, from 1799 to 1809, and later from 1843 to 1853, Sir George Cayley discovered the basic principles of the whole science of aviation. This, then, was the first flying field in history. And here, Derek Piggott was to recreate the coachman's classic flight.
At the Dale, the wind was really very favourable with 10 or 15 mile an hour wind blowing up the slope, so the chance of getting off the ground had greatly improved. But of course the one unknown factor is how the aeroplane's going to behave when it's just towed along by manpower instead of with the motor car. And although it's one thing to get the thing off the ground, it's another thing to level it out in time for a good landing. Okay, we're all set to go. I've got the stick back just to get off as quick as I can. Walk! Run! Keep going. Let go! Oh, we're slightly stumped, but we're quite all right.
Piggott's reaction was typically cool, but to those of us who were watching, it was a most frightening crash.
We eventually ended up in the downdraft from the hill in front, and that resulted in a very heavy landing, which we broke the axle and various little pieces of the aeroplane. But on the whole, we think that we probably accomplished at least as much as Sir George's coachman accomplished. It seems such a pity, having gone to the time and expense to build this aeroplane, not to see exactly what it was capable of, and we knew it would fly, but now we want to explore it still further. A little bit faster, just getting airborne. Airborne, that's fine. No faster, slower. A little bit faster, a little bit faster. That's fine, hold it. As you move the boom itself tends to bend, and so you feel very little immediate response, and the airplane gradually changes its course, or noses up or noses down, and having some control, but not all the control you'd really like. And so all the time there's this feeling that you might lose it at some moment, and it might go out of control, but every time it proved its stability, and each time we move the control, we find that it does actually come back, and it all works, and it all happens all right, just as it should.
Here, then, was the proof. Sir George Cayley's incredible flying machine was the forerunner of the modern aircraft. But how ironical that he is now largely forgotten in the country of his birth. For in the words of French historian Charles Dollfuss, Cayley was the true inventor of the aeroplane and one of the most powerful geniuses in the history of aviation.